Well, in the communications back and forth between myself and some of the Pearson folks, I've seen some documents that show the title of this talk as saying cognitive assessment of diverse populations, which is kind of a generic title that we came up with some years ago, but it's admittedly bland. It doesn't tell you much. So if you look at the slide, you'll see the newest title for our webinar this afternoon: Knowns, Unknowns, and Best Practices Evaluating Bias in Cognitive Assessment of Diverse Populations. And this title is considerably more detailed. In a nutshell, we will be going to spend a lot of time discussing the question, are IQ tests biased against culturally diverse groups? And are there issues that we need to be aware of as practitioners giving IQ tests that help us to be a little bit more sensitive to any cultural issues that might come up during testing? So, with that as a general title, I just want to give you some background that will give you kind of an idea as to where I'm coming from. And as you see in this slide, I say that all the information that will be presented in this webinar is included in a new book that hopefully will be published either at the end of this year or at the beginning of next year. And the reason for that is because when I started doing these webinars about 4 years ago, I discovered very quickly that there's so much information to talk about on this topic. And I just tried to stuff as much information as I could into 2 hours. Now, 2 hours is admittedly a long time, but I even found that I couldn't get all the information in 2 hours. And I feared that it would be information overload. And so one of the things that became evident to me very quickly is that I needed to put all this material in a book. And I approached the Wiley people who published the Wiley Essential series, and they gave me permission to put all this information in a new book. So I guess my message to you is, if this seems like too much information, and I'll try to make sure that it's presented in a way that's a bit simpler, but it may come off to you as this a lot of information. Don't worry, because hopefully this book will be published, and I'm hoping that this book will be able to be in the hands of a lot of people once it comes out. Just to give you some background, I attended grad school in California in the late 1980s. And for those of you who know your history, this was the time of the Larry P. versus Wilson Riles court case that was decided in 1979. And if you were a school psychology student during that time in California, you constantly heard this steady drumbeat that IQ tests are bad, IQ tests are biased, IQ tests are racist. And for those of you, again, who are familiar with that period of time, the California Department of Education, after that Larry P. decision came out in 1979, they banned school psychologists from giving IQ tests to Black children for any special education purpose. So from the early 80s on, if you were a school psychologist in the state of California and you had a Black student that was referred to you for any reason, you were not allowed to give them an IQ test. And that was primarily because the plaintiff psychologists in the Larry P. case convinced the judge that IQ tests were biased, and as a result, Judge Peckham, he's passed away now, but Judge Peckham had banned the administration of IQ tests for Black children in the entire state. Now, recently, that decision has been relaxed somewhat. For close to 4 decades, if you were a school psychologist in California, you were not allowed to give IQ tests to Black children. But just recently, the State Department of Education has relaxed that ban so that now school psychologists are allowed to give IQ tests to Black children, but they are still not allowed to give IQ tests to Black children if the context is making decisions about intellectual disability. So you can give an IQ test to Black children for any other issue, but you cannot give them still for any kind of problem solving related to an intellectual disability. So, since giving IQ tests in schools is the major responsibility of school psychologists, you would have thought that school psychology training programs throughout the state would all be on the same page as to defending the use of IQ tests in the state. But sadly, this was not the case. Now, the California Association of School Psychologists did make a valiant effort to come together to try to get these rulings overturned, but as you know, they were unsuccessful. Most training programs, whether or not you're in California or any other state, most training programs who require IQ testing courses find that they simply don't have a lot of time to go into detail about test bias issues. There are so many issues that need to be learned in any typical testing courses. You have to actually, give practice tests to kids. You have to learn how to score the tests. You have to learn how to write reports. You have to learn about reliability, validity, standardization, norms, and that just takes up the whole semester. And it's rare that training programs have the time to talk about issues of test bias. And so that was one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book. I wanted this book to be a resource for training programs and also a resource for working school psychologists so that if they come across any kinds of arguments or criticisms related to IQ testing with diverse populations, they would have a resource to consult that would give them the proper response to these kinds of criticisms. So, with that in place, let's just keep going. And again, I will try to clarify for you any information. When the slides have a lot of information, I'll just try to make sure to just simplify what's being shown because again, I know that there's a lot of information that is being thrown at you at once. In terms of the overview for this webinar, we have learning objectives. I'm going to talk briefly about defining important terms in these discussions. Then I will go into detail about what we call alternative assessment paradigms, particularly in the 1980s and the 1990s, and particularly in school psychology. There was a lot of writing and there was a lot of discussion on alternatives to IQ testing, and a lot of this was prompted by Larry P. and some other writings as well. So whenever I bring up a particular alternative paradigm to discuss, I'll subdivide the conversation into these subpoints. I'll talk about how that paradigm criticizes IQ testing, because obviously, in order to sell an alternative paradigm, you have to basically bash IQ tests. So we'll talk about how they criticize IQ tests. We'll then talk about what the underlying assessment philosophy or rationale is in the alternative assessment paradigm. I'll describe very briefly what the method is in terms of the alternative assessment paradigm, and then we'll end with the flaws of these methods. So Again, I will talk about the criticisms, the underlying philosophy, the description of the method, and then the flaws. And then we will face directly this question: are popularly used IQ tests, are they biased or are they discriminatory against certain population groups? And then we will talk about what I feel is one of the most important topics of this webinar, and that is the issue of what are the classroom learning or behavioral characteristics of pupils who obtain IQ scores within certain ranges. And, we always have to remember that we don't just give IQ tests just to give tests, but we're trying to understand a very important psychological trait, and that's general intellectual ability. And so when we make those decisions after we test kids, we have to recognize that there are real life correlates of IQ scores to how children actually function in a classroom setting and also in life. So I want to make sure that if we seem to be running out of time, I want to make sure that we allow time for that particular topic. And then at the end, we'll make sure we have time for questions and answers. So real quickly, the learning objectives here, we'll number one, I'll describe different terms and then I'll give definitions for those terms. Number two, I'd like you to be able to describe at least three different types of alternative assessment that have been promoted in the past and currently, and to understand, at least at a basic level, what the argument is from proponents of these methods as to why they think their method is superior to IQ testing. Number three, I'd like you to be able to describe at least two pros and two cons of at least three different alternative assessment paradigms that have been promoted by scholars in both school psychology and special education. And then number four, when IQ tests cannot be used, learners will be able to describe, again, the classroom learning, behavioral, and social emotional characteristics of kids who obtain IQ score within certain ranges. So that's kind of the broad overview of what I'd like for us to learn through this webinar. Okay, so understanding the task before us, basically, and again, I don't want to insult people's intelligence, but I just want to start at the very beginning. We all understand that when we work for schools, clinics, or hospitals, that a primary need is for assessment to occur that would give us information about the client's general mental ability. And there's two aspects to that. Many times we give IQ tests because we want to know directly what is this child's level of intellectual functioning. But also there is an indirect need as well, and that is to have a measure of general intellectual functioning to serve as an exclusionary factor for other disabling conditions. So that if you work in schools, for example, and you're problem solving and assessing kids related to suspected emotional disturbance, you know that you have to rule out IQ problems as a source of the issues that the child is being faced with. Same thing with learning disabilities. We want to assess for learning disabilities directly, but one of the things that we want to have as an exclusionary factor is that the child's general mental ability is not a contributing factor to the problems that they are experiencing in the classroom. So the last point here is very key. We must have confidence in the integrity of our general mental ability assessments in order to have confidence in our professional assessment practices. So to the left, I have kind of an interesting statement there, IQ testing, is it our friend or is it our foe? So we want to be very objective in terms of how we answer that question. And I do have to say to start off that there are many quotes that you'll run across in the psychology literature that will say things to the effect of, and I'll just read this first quote. Warren in 2020, and he published a book on IQ testing, and he makes this statement on page 1 of the book. He says, the scientific study of intelligence is probably the greatest success story in psychology, possibly in all of the social sciences. Gottfredson in 2009 said, intelligence testing may be psychology's greatest single achievement. So those are uh, very assertive statements. But yet, and looking at this third point, yet even though many psychologists will say this, because of or in spite of this, intelligence and intelligence testing is subject to the most virulent hostility, the aggressive promotion of misinformation from academia, from the popular press, from the courts, from the visual media, and there are attempts to have their use curtailed or banned outright. And so I already shared with you the issues related to the Larry P. case in California, where a group of activist psychologists were successful in convincing a state judge to ban IQ tests, and that has occurred for at least 4 decades, and it's only now being relaxed. So I'm not talking about this problem as a minor problem. It is a major issue. And so we really need to be educated to understand how we not let things like this happen in the future, because there will always be virulent criticisms against IQ testing, and you'll need to know how to respond to those criticisms. Okay, now I've been around for a long time. I'm retired now, but like I said before, I attended grad school in the 1980s. And so I was around as a graduate student during the heyday of the Larry P. case in the 80s. But I was also a university faculty member in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s. And during that time, particularly in school psychology, the alternative assessment movement was reaching its peak in school psychology and special education journals. And so now in 2024, even though some of those movements have died down a bit, we know a lot about the various philosophies that underlie the alternative assessment movement. We know a lot about the methods that they use and about their shortcomings and flaws. So, sympathy for and curiosity about alternative assessments compared to traditional IQ testing never seems to die. In other words, we will always have the need for IQ testing, but there's a parallel movement of hostility towards IQ testing. And there always seems to be research or ideas that come out or movements that are started that will argue that we need to replace IQ tests with some kind of an alternative assessment paradigm. So again, we are going to be addressing the basic question, is traditional testing culturally biased? How would we find out if they are? And is alternative testing a better choice for clinicians? Why or why not? So I'm going to talk about bias charges as they are aimed at how you select an IQ test to use in your professional setting. I'm going to talk about bias in or bias claims in the standardization of IQ tests. We'll talk about bias claims in how you administer and score IQ tests. and we'll talk about bias claims in how you interpret IQ tests. So we have a lot to talk about. Okay, so defining terms. Okay, starting with assessment. Assessment, and I'll just go ahead and try to go through these slides fairly quickly. Assessment basically is the process of gathering information. So it's a very broad term that refers to a lot of things in addition to formal testing. Testing is a subset of the assessment process where basically you're exposing the client to a very structured and standardized group of tasks from which you're going to derive a single score or a set of scores. So assessment is the broader term. Testing is a subset of assessment that deals with what you're most familiar with when you sit down with a child or adult and you give them a standardized test. Norms are basically scores from a representative reference group that has known characteristics. In other words, we know about the geographic regions that they come from, we know about their age, we know about their family characteristics, we know about their socioeconomic status, we know about their racial or ethnic group membership or their gender. And then we take that reference group, we look at the scores, and whenever we test any individual client, we compare that individual client's scores against the scores made from the reference group. And that's how we can make determinations as to where a person falls with respect to the continuum of general intellectual ability. Okay, standardization is the process during the development of a test whereby the rules are set for how you are to set up the testing situation, how you are to administer the tasks, and how you are to score the tasks. So whenever we talk about standardization, we're basically talking about a set of rules that are established in a test manual that everyone has to adhere to whenever they administer a test. And only when you adhere to these standardized rules can you accurately compare one student's scores against other students' scores. If you deviate from the standardization process, it makes it that much more difficult for you to compare scores among students, and it introduces a lot of error into your assessment. Now, this slide basically gives us a definition of general mental ability. Now, there are many definitions that you've come across in your graduate school work and possibly in your in-service work. So there are many definitions. This is just one that I particularly like because it gives us a general idea. And so I'll just go ahead and read that. This is from a Gottfredson article in 1997. And she defines intelligence as a very general mental capability that, among other things, involves the ability to reason, plan, solve problems, think abstractly, comprehend complex ideas, learn quickly, and learn from experience. It is not merely book learning, a narrow academic skill, or test taking smarts. Rather, it reflects a broader and deeper capability for comprehending our surroundings, involving such phrases as catching on, making sense of things, or figuring out what to do. And so, one of the things, again, that I said previously is at the end of this presentation, I'm really looking forward to us discussing in detail what what the practical observations that we see in actual classrooms or in life that are associated with IQ scores within certain ranges, because again, that's ultimately what we are concerned about. We give tests not just to give tests and give a score, but the scores from our tests actually mean something in the real world. And we'll go ahead and discuss some of that a little bit later on in this presentation. Okay, so in terms of definitions, these are just some definitions that tend to have a lot of confusion related to them. And we just want to clear up some of that confusion. And one of the confusing terms that we often use whenever we talk about testing comes from the word discrimination. Many times you may have seen titles from articles or books that will talk about non-discriminatory testing. And that's an unfortunate choice of words because it can confuse things a bit. So I just want to offer some clarification as to what this word discrimination truly means in the context of testing, and in particular, IQ testing. In a broad sense, many people use that word discrimination to mean an ability to discern differences in the qualities of people and things and choosing accordingly. So that's kind of a neutral definition that basically says that whenever you're judging something and you're discerning differences, you are being discriminative in your mental processes. All it means is telling the difference between things. But in the narrow sense, this word can be used in a way that has a negative connotation. And sometimes you'll hear the word discrimination being used to mean treating people negatively based on arbitrary assumptions or aversions concerning individuals based upon their race, ethnicity, appearance, sex, etc. So in this particular usage of the term, you're all familiar with a situation where maybe a person walks into a store, and let's say they're the wrong ethnicity or what have you, and the shopkeeper refuses them service. And in that sense, we would say that that shopkeeper is acting in a discriminatory fashion against that customer. So that's the narrow definition of that word, and it means something negative.
Dr. Frisby, sorry to interrupt. I'm just going to let you know we're at about 30 minutes into our session today. For those of you that are listening in and you have questions, we are answering some questions live as they're typed into the Q&A. I am marking some questions that are coming in, some of the really deep questions, so that we can get Dr. Frisby's expertise at the end. But just to let people know, go ahead and continue to put questions in the Q&A, and we will also document those questions, share them with Dr. Frisby, and get his feedback to share with people at the end.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm going to need to really hurry up here. So yeah, so another way that discrimination is used in testing is basically you're saying that there's something inherent in a test content or administration that puts test takers from certain groups at a disadvantage. You're saying that something is inherent in the test that is underestimating their true score or putting them at a disadvantage. Um, Another term you will hear batted around a lot is test fairness. And so many times test developers will advertise their new tests as being more fair to certain subgroups for whatever reasons. Um, and, some clinicians or particularly some test critics will sometimes believe that if you alter the test content or you alter how a test is administered, or you alter how scores are interpreted or how scores are used, that will make the test more fair to test takers. Now, there's a problem with using the word in that way, and you just need to be aware as to what psychometricians and also various test panels say related to usage of that word fair. And they want you to know that the issue of what is or is not fair really belongs to the realm of morality, philosophy, or metaphysics, And those realms defy objective agreement. In other words, different people have different ideas as to what fairness means. So when you're talking about tests and you're trying to discern test bias is related to objective techniques of psychometrics and statistics. And it's not very helpful to use the word fairness in as it relates to tests. So that's just basically, a caveat for you to avoid saying that a particular test is or is not fair, because that tends to be a term that is a philosophical term rather than a term dealing with measurement and psychometrics. So at this point, I want to just talk a little bit about what we mean when we say a test is biased and what we don't mean when we say that a test is biased. So in this slide, if you direct your attention to this particular uh, presentation here, this is showing basically the distribution of group scores between what we will call Group A and Group B. And you'll see that even though both groups have a distribution of scores that are normally distributed, Group A has a lower mean in their test score distribution than Group B. Okay. Most people that call test bias will say that this is why they feel that a test is biased. In other words, they define bias as whenever two or more groups get different means in their distribution of test scores. And I've included a quote here on the left from a recent psychology textbook, which will kind of show this misunderstanding. And this person says, one way to keep minorities down was through intelligence testing. It has taken decades to prove this hypothesis incorrect. And what they mean there is when we find that some minority groups have lower mean scores in the intelligence test distribution, they argue, and this is in a modern psychology textbook, they say that this is wrong, this is incorrect, and that we know, and I use that as in air quotes, we know that intelligence tests are culturally biased. So basically, this kind of idea is widespread, unfortunately. There is a category of bias that basically says that you can determine bias in a test by just looking at the items. And this is the strategy that the activist psychologists use in the Larry P. court case, is where a lot of their testimony says that they would bring up a test item, and then they would make a long-winded argument as to how this test item was biased against black children, their argument being that black children grow up in a different culture than white children, and then they would make an argument as to why this particular test item would put black children at a disadvantage. Okay. So basically, these kinds of arguments stem not from empirical considerations, because the plaintiff psychologist never provided any data to back up what they were saying, but basically their arguments were socio-political in nature and not empirical in nature. So one of the main points that I would like for us to really take away from this webinar is that if ever you are going to evaluate bias or say that an item or a certain test is biased, you have to do that through empirical methods, not through philosophical or ideological arguments. So many people who believe that tests are biased, they are operating from what we call the culture-bound fallacy. And that fallacy concerns the notion that one can simply look at a test item and assume on this basis alone that it is biased or unfair when used with certain groups. And again, bias has to be determined empirically not subjectively. There's another fallacy that you will run across occasionally called the standardization fallacy. And this fallacy rests on claims that because a test was standardized on a given population, it is ipso facto, and that's just a word that means by this fact, that a test is by this fact biased or unfair when used in any other population. We know that many groups who do well on English language IQ tests are not significantly represented in the standardization sample. In fact, we have dozens of studies that have been conducted on people living in other countries who take American IQ tests, and they achieve scores that are significantly higher than the scores made by American samples, even though they were not represented in the standardization group. So at the bottom here, I just cite a study, and I talk about this study at length in my book. And that's a study that systematically went out to study whether or not tests, particularly achievement tests, were biased because of their standardization samples. And so if you get a chance to get that book, read about this particular study by Fan, and that will debunk the standardization fallacy. Now, if you look at the standards for educational and psychological testing published by APA, um, um, the Educational Research Association, American AERA, and the National Council on Measurement in Education, and that was published in 2014. They are at work in updating that, but the latest standards document basically gives you a definition for what to look for whenever you want to evaluate a test as being biased. And what they say in their standards is that bias, in their view, and again, this is a panel of testing experts from all over the world, they say that a test is biased if it is measuring what they call is construct underrepresentation or construct irrelevant components of test scores. And what they're basically saying is that a test has to measure what the manual says it's measuring. So when we give IQ tests, we are hoping to get information on general mental ability. But if there's something in the test that is measuring something other than general mental ability, we would then say that that test is measuring construct irrelevant components, and therefore there's bias in the testing. Another way that they define bias in the standards document is they say that whenever you give a test and you get scores, we have to conduct studies that will basically correlate our scores with criterion measures outside of the testing situation. That's why we are giving tests. So that if we do that and we find that our scores under or over predict the criterion outside of the testing situation, we would then say that that test is showing predictive bias. And then the third point there on that slide is basically saying that whenever we are accusing tests of bias, we're basically saying that there is systematic error in the scores that we're getting from that test. And by systematic error, we're simply saying that the test is consistently underestimating or overestimating the score for any test taker that belongs to a particular group. But it doesn't do that when examinees from a different group take the test. So an example that I can give for systematic error is for you to imagine, let's say I had a weight scale, and we all are familiar with standing on a weight scale to see how much we weigh. If I were to take that scale and I were to manipulate the dials in that scale such that anyone who stood on that scale would get a reading that is 5 pounds under what they really weigh, that would be a systematic error effect. And so when it comes to testing, anybody who is accusing a test of bias is saying whenever anybody from group A takes the test, they're getting an underestimate of their true score. But if anybody from group B takes the test, they're getting an accurate measure of their score. That's what we mean whenever we say that there's systematic error in a test. Okay, so I'm probably going to have to go through this section pretty quickly. This is the section that begins our discussion of alternative assessment paradigms that we have seen all through the decades that basically criticize IQ tests and try to promote and get people to buy into an alternative paradigm. So whenever I talk about an alternative paradigm, I'll break it down into these 4 points. I'll talk about the main criticism that they have of IQ tests. Then we'll talk about how that method is described. Then we'll talk about the underlying assumptions of the method. And then we'll talk about the method's major flaws. So here's one of them. It's called the System of Multicultural Pluralistic Assessment. And again, I'm very aware of the fact that I'm probably a bit older than many of you in the audience. So I started grad school in the 80s, and this was very big in the 70s and the 80s in the school psychology and special education literature. But I do recognize that many of you who are present at this webinar may have no idea what this system was. It's abbreviated the SAMPA. So some of you older folks in the audience may know what the SAMPA was. Many of you probably don't, but let me just describe it very briefly. This slide talks about the underlying philosophy of the SAMPA, and let me just summarize it. Basically, the test developers were saying we see society as very pluralistic, and what that means to them is they see society as composed of a core society of what they call Anglo values and culture. But then they say there are other cultures in society that are distinct and different from the Anglo culture, and that individuals who are not Anglo grow up in a social milieu that is very, very different from the dominant cultures. That's the underlying philosophy. And they believe that people need to be evaluated not through comparing their performance with the general population, but the philosophy of this method says that clients need to be evaluated only within the norms of their socio-cultural group. So we'll see how they do that. So basically, in describing this particular message, the idea behind the SAMPA, and again, this was in the late 70s, early 80s, when the WISC-R was the main test that people were giving. The idea here is that you give a WISC-R test, but instead of using the score that you get from the test, you look at how that score falls in relation to the examinee's sociocultural group. So if sociocultural group A has a lower mean score on average compared to sociocultural group B, this means under the SAMPA philosophy that a score of 115, let's say, made by an examinee from group A, it might be at the 90th percentile for that group, but the same score of 115 made by an examinee from group B may be at the 75th percentile for that group. So in other words, two members of the group get the same score, but the SAMPA sees the scores as different because in the context of one group, a score of 115 may be in the 90th percentile, and in the context of another group, a score of 115 may be at the 75th percentile. So the SAMPA philosophy argues that the 115 score made by a person from group A has to be artificially raised in order to reflect its higher percentile ranking within that particular group. So instead of assigning that test taker a score of 115 that they made on the WISC-R, the SAMPA method will, let's say, add 11 points to that score, as well as changing the name of that score to what they call an ELP score, which stands for Estimated Learning Potential Score. So the result here is that a 115 score on the WISC-R made by a person from group A is changed to an ELP score of 126, and the person from group B who made the same score of 115 on the WISC-R, he would still have that same score of 115. So this is kind of a visual of how that looks like. So under the SAMPA philosophy, if you look on the left, this is what you would find if you're dealing with two groups that have uh, significantly different means in their distribution of scores. And let's say you have a cutoff for either deciding who's going to be in gifted or who's going to be put in a class for the intellectually disabled. You'll see that if the two groups have different distributions, but you evaluate them in terms of your decision making using a same cutoff score, more people from group A will fall below the cutoff score than people from group B. And conversely, if you're making a decision where you're looking at people above a cutoff score, more people from group B will make a score above the cutoff, less people from group A will make that score. So the SAPA developers said that that's unfair, that that's biased. So what they did is they implemented this system that basically altered the scores made by Group A into what they called ELP scores. And so when you do all of the math in there, it would give people the same distributions of ELP scores because people are being evaluated only within the context of their social cultural group. And you see the outcome. If you have a set uh, score cutoff for making a decision, then both groups have the same proportion of people that would achieve scores either above or below that cutoff. So flaws of the method, and I won't go through this, I'm trying to rush through this. Basically, there have been studies done where they've looked at the practical validity of making decisions from ELP scores, and they basically found, and this is one study that I talk about at length in the book, and I want you to just focus on this red text here. They found that ELP scores overestimated the performance of minority students on achievement tests. In other words, they performed less well than their ELP scores would predict. The researchers concluded that ELP scores were inferior to IQ scores in predicting future achievement, and that ELP scores showed no evidence of students demonstrating extra learning potential in whatever special education categories in which they were placed. So psychometrically, ELP scores weren't of much use. And so as a result of this, the SAMPA method basically disappeared after the 1980s. Okay, here's another alternative assessment method, and it's basically accusing tests of being biased because of the fact that different American subgroups will often display different dialects in their language. So let me kind of talk about this for a bit. And mainly, the criticism made by these folks are that, and I'll just read that top point here. Due to cultural isolation, some English speaking American subgroups speak in dialects that differ from mainstream standard English. Thus, they would have difficulty understanding or responding to verbal instructions or verbally loaded test items that are worded in proper English dialects. So, some examples of what some of those dialects are, you may have heard of Ebonics, and Ebonics is basically a dialect that is manifested by some Black children, particularly in certain kinds of environments, that refers to a kind of vernacular that is different from standard American English. We've also identified a dialect called Chicano English and another dialect called Cajun vernacular. So an example of that is on the left, you have the English phrases or words, and on the right, particularly if we're looking at Ebonics, you have sometimes what you hear some Black kids say with respect to how they translate in Ebonics standard English. So there was he passed away some time ago, but there was a famous Black psychologist by the name of Robert Williams, and Robert Williams was basically known as a very hostile IQ test critic, and basically he invented what is kind of a tongue-in-cheek test of urban ghetto slang, and he argued that Black students would score higher than white students on this intelligence test, and if they did, it would prove his point that the lower scores of Black students on traditional intelligence tests were due to unfamiliarity with white culture. So basically, he invented, and again, it was more of a tongue-in-cheek idea, but his ideas were embraced by many people, where he invented this multiple choice intelligence test that he called the bitch test, and that stood for Black Intelligence Test of Cultural Homogeneity. So these are two sample items of this test. So one reads, if a judge finds you holding wood in California, what's the most he can give you? And so many folks, Black or white, wouldn't have the slightest idea what's being talked about here. But this is kind of street slang for basically if you're holding a weapon or something that you're not supposed to, and if you were arrested for it, what would the judge give you? And the right answer is C, a dime, and that's slang for 10 years. And here's the other question. Running a game means, and then the right answer is getting what one wants. So this is basically ghetto slang, and here's the right answer. So basically what happened with this test is that, Williams gave the test to a group of Black and white college students, and of course he found that Black students had higher scores uh, than white students. And so his argument was uh, that validates his notion that regular IQ tests are biased because Black students weren't able to get high scores because they were trying to answer questions that were phrased in the vernacular of middle class white culture. But then, there is a extensive literature that looked psychometrically at the bitch test, and basically they found that the bitch test showed no correlations whatsoever with Wechsler verbal and performance scales. The correlations were not significantly different from zero. They found no evidence that the bitch test measured general intelligence or demonstrated significant predictive validity for any variable of practical importance, either within Black or white groups. Okay, here's another alternative assessment paradigm called the learning potential assessment paradigm. And one of the reasons why you see a picture of this gentleman here is that that picture is a picture of a late psychologist by the name of Reuven Feuerstein. Reuven Feuerstein was an Israeli psychologist that was the director of psychological services at an organization in Israel that was tasked with trying to basically house kids that were fleeing Nazi persecution in World War II. And this organization was also housing youth that were fleeing war conditions and poverty conditions in other countries in North Africa. So basically, Dr. Feuerstein found that whenever he tried to evaluate these kids with IQ tests, he would find that they were very, very deficient in how they approached problem solving on these IQ tests. They would be distractible, they wouldn't be systematic in how they solve problems, and they would get very, very low scores. And so basically, he developed a theory which argued that the reason why these students were getting very, very low scores is because they didn't have the problem solving repertoire to do well on these tests. And he found that after he spent some time with them teaching them how to solve problems on IQ tests, that when he retested them with the same IQ test later, they would get higher scores. So from that, he developed a theory of what he called cognitive modifiability based upon what he called mediated learning experiences. So basically, his argument was that many kids who grow up in ghetto or low class or lower SES backgrounds, particularly who come from situations in which there's a lot of either family chaos or social chaos, he felt that the reason why they did poorly on tests was because that they needed to be taught these mediated learning experience to help them to do well on tests. So anyway, this is a slide that talks about some of his criticisms of tests. He basically criticized traditional tests by basically saying that they fail to assess the subject's future potential for learning. They don't give the client the opportunity to display cognitive processes that underlie learning. Um, and basically they don't give clients the opportunity to really learn the task in order to do well on the task. So this assessment philosophy has gone under many names. Some of you may or may not be familiar with these names, but some of the names that this assessment method has been called is the dynamic assessment movement, or the learning potential or learning propensity assessment movement, the interactive assessment movement, or the test, teach, test procedure movement. And there's a lot of different psychologists that have done research on these, under the banner of these different names. The basic idea here in this assessment method is that you go through the following process when you assess a student's intelligence. Step one is you give them, using standardized procedure, the intelligence test, and you follow the standardized procedures. Step two is that then you take that child and you actually train them by giving them similar or the same test items, and you actually talk them through how they would solve those items. So you spend a period of time meeting with the child individually, using tasks from a regular intelligence test, and teach them how to solve the tasks uh, uh, represented by the items on those tests. Then step three is that you retest the subject using the same intelligence test that you gave in step one, or a similar intelligence test that you gave in step one, and you score that test and you look for whether or not the student's score has improved from step one to step three. So if the student's score improved, then you would surmise that that improvement score illustrates that the student has learning potential that was missed when you gave the test in step one. So that score that you get in step four is called the change score. And that change score would basically illustrate the student's learning potential. So here's an example of that. let's say, you have
Dr.
test one.
Frisby, just a quick time check. We're about halfway, a little bit past halfway through the presentation time for today.
Gotcha.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you. So on test one, you would give the test, and let's say you got a score of 8. You would, in between test one and test two, you would have training. You give the student the same test again, and let's say he gets 10 on that second test administration, then his change score would be +2. Okay, for this student, maybe his score might have gone down, so his score was -6, and maybe for this student, the score was the same and his score was 0. Feuerstein would argue that the student who gave you this profile here would be illustrative of a student who has learning potential, and that the regular IQ test didn't provide that, and therefore giving a regular IQ test to particularly students who have bad backgrounds or very impoverished backgrounds doesn't give you a measure of their learning potential. So again, I'm going to go through this real quickly, but basically, I talk about in my book that basically Feuerstein was setting up a straw man to knock down, where he was criticizing IQ tests for reasons that were basically not valid. He was saying that IQ tests don't give students an opportunity to learn tasks, and IQ tests do. Many times, the beginning items of many subtests give students an opportunity to practice on items, so that was false. But there are other reasons why this method is not a good method, or was found not to be a good method, and that is basically how they interpreted change scores from one testing to another. And the main point that I make in the book is that there are many reasons why a student might get a different score on a second testing than they would have gotten on the first testing, and many of these reasons have nothing to do with giving them training in between the testings. And then again, there's a psychometric reason for that. There are many articles that basically show psychometrically that change scores in and of themselves are very poor scores to make decisions on, because they tend not to be reliable. So let me just go through that real quickly. Um, Let me talk about one more, and then I'm going to try to get to the end where we can talk about, again, some of the practical things that we observed with students who make IQ scores in various ranges. So some test critics feel that if you make up a test that has no verbal items in it, that test is, again, more fair to various groups and has a greater potential not to be biased. So here's an example of what their argument would look like. So, you look at this question. A shack is to skyscraper as a canoe is to, and then you have 4 choices. The right answer is yacht. Okay. So, a shack is a very primitive building. A skyscraper is a very big modern building. In the same way, a canoe is a very primitive flotation device. And, the analogy would then lead you to yacht being the answer. The argument that many people make here is that a poor, let's say, inner city child would not know what a yacht is compared to a more affluent child, so they would tend to get this item wrong. So test critics in this camp feel that any verbal items on tests are automatically biased because they would disadvantage kids, particularly those who are poor and do not have the advantages that more affluent kids had. So I go through this. I'm going to go through this really fast. The basic idea there is that uh, whenever you have any kind of a nonverbal test, even if it has no verbal items, or even if it's administered completely non-verbally, we still find ethnic, social class, and racial group differences in the scores, even if the test is administered completely non-verbally. Okay. Now I'm going to just rush through a lot of these slides here. And as I told you before, there's so much information here that it's very difficult to get through all of this. And that's why I would, again, urge you to get the book because it has all of these methods in there. I talk about curriculum-based assessment. And again, I was on the school psychology faculty during the 80s and 90s where curriculum-based assessment was very popular. Curriculum-based assessment is a method where you evaluate kids using items that are found in the school curriculum rather than using items that are found on IQ tests. So you would give these worksheets to kids, and they would have math problems, or they may have uh, words in different phonetic categories, and then you would time them. Time them. You would give them 1 to 3 minutes to fill out these worksheets, and then you would score the worksheets as the number of correct items per minute. And then you would graph the student's performance across weeks and months. And basically, that is the way that you would make decisions about their schooling. And I know that many of you are familiar with the response to intervention movement, and that movement uses curriculum-based assessment in many of its activities. So again, I'm summarizing real quickly because I want to get to the end here. Uh, the curriculum-based assessment movement is very good for helping teachers and diagnosticians to make decisions related to the classroom curriculum, but it is not a measure of general mental ability. And one of the things we still find whenever we do studies using curriculum-based assessments, we still find that there are group differences with respect to outcomes. So it doesn't, curriculum-based assessment doesn't make group differences and outcomes go away. And again, it is not a measure of general mental ability. And so if you are giving students tests in schools because you want to learn something about general mental ability, you don't give a curriculum-based assessment, you give an IQ test. So let me go real quickly, and I just want to get to the end here because I really want to talk about uh, this thing at the end here. So okay, this is where I want to end up with because I wanted this webinar to be very, very practical to you. And, this is something that we all learn in our beginning testing classes and our beginning measurement classes. We learn that general mental ability is distributed normally. And you might have heard the term bell-shaped curve or bell curve. Basically, this is a phenomenon that is characteristic of a variety of psychological traits and physical traits. So whether you're talking about traits like weight or height or extroversion or introversion, whatever that might be, most psychological traits are distributed normally. And what we mean there is that if we start with low scores, very few people get very low scores. But then as you move towards the middle, more and more people get scores that are closer to the middle. And then when you get to the middle, you have a lot of people that fall in the middle. And then if you keep going up to higher and higher scores, fewer and fewer people get high scores. So these are the percentages of people that get scores under the normal curve. So basically the argument here that I'm making is that there's a lot that we know about kids who get IQ scores within any of these ranges. So what I want to do is go through what some of those characteristics are, because that's the reason why you're giving IQ tests. You want to find out about the learning characteristics of these kids, and IQ tests have been around for a long time, and they're excellent means to do that. So let's start with people at the very low range here. So, what are the learning and behavioral characteristics of pupils that have IQs less than or equal to 70? Okay, if you're testing a kid, they get an IQ below 70. What do we know about the learning characteristics of those children? Well, we do know that, throughout history, particularly organizations for mental retardation have subdivided kids with very low IQ into basically four categories. Now, uh, um, advocates for mental retardation are trying to move away from this because they would argue that IQ scores are not very reliable in these ranges. But I would argue that basically when you're getting into IQ scores in these ranges, the learning characteristics are pretty much obvious. So basically you have people who get IQs between 55 and 70, and they are people in the mild mental handicap categories. These are individuals that you will likely run into working in regular schools, but they need special education assistance. When you get to IQs that are lower than or right around this range here, you will, if you work in public schools, you will probably have little contact with these kids because they tend to be in institutions. So for kids that get IQs between 40 and 55, these are kids that you can tell even before they reach public schooling age that they have mental and developmental disabilities, and they typically receive special education outside of the regular schools. For kids that are between the IQs of 25 to 40, these are kids that also have associated physical or genetic anomalies such as Down syndrome, spina bifida, or cerebral palsy. And then if you have kids that have IQs below 25, these are kids that are often non-ambulatory, meaning that they're often in wheelchairs and they need consistent round-the-clock institutionalized care because they can't go to bathroom on their own, they can't feed themselves on their own, so they have to have constant supervision. So let's talk about the kids that you're most likely to run into in the public schools who are within IQs of 55 to 70. These are kids that from birth, they move through the typical stages of academic, communication, or motor development more slowly than their average IQ peers. And these are basically scores that you would get from some kind of an adaptive behavior inventory. However, when you see these kids in the context of a regular classroom with kids who have higher IQs, it's harder to see social or emotional characteristics that may differ from higher IQ kids. They look like other kids, social or emotionally, but the problems begin to become evident when they begin to interact with academic material that is found in school tasks. So teachers and parents find that these are the kids that are at least 2 years behind the other kids in their academic subjects. They have significant memory and attentional difficulties. At best, they can achieve a level of academic learning up to the sixth grade, and they need special education services no later than the fourth grade. And I have a reference here. I wrote a book in 2013 where I talk at length about basically these characteristics. So if you want to talk more about that, you can go ahead and consult that book. Okay, moving up a bit now to kids with a little bit higher IQs. These are kids between IQs of 70 to 85. What are their learning characteristics that are typically observed? These are kids that are most likely to fall between the cracks of special and regular education, meaning that their functioning is too high for special education, but it's too low for regular education. So that's what we mean when we say these are the kids that fall in the cracks. These kids between 70 and 85, they have a greater than average difficulty with multi-step or cognitively complex tasks. They have a preference for concrete over abstract learning in high school, and they're more likely to gravitate to vo-tech classes. So to give you kind of a concrete example of that, by the time kids in this IQ range get to high school, some of the other kids are learning algebra, geometry, trigonometry, calculus. These are the kids that are still struggling with fractions. So their learning is very concrete. They have difficulty with generalizing learned material to new situations. They have a restricted fund of general knowledge, very short attention span, very poor concentration. They need additional practice and longer amounts of time to learn the same material as learned by kids with higher IQs. They don't like to read. They avoid reading. You always have to struggle with them to take home books to read. Reading for them is a very, very aversive experience. And concomitantly, they have poor reading comprehension skills, very low academic motivation. They learn to dislike school very early on, and they are the kids that are most that have the higher likelihood for dropping out of school. And from the teacher's perspective, these are the students that tend to be the C and D students in classrooms. And there are also correlated social problems too, related to kids who tend to fall within this particular range. Again, these are the slow learners, and these are they present very difficult problems for teachers to have to manage in the regular classroom. Okay, moving up again, now we're at the range where we're talking about the majority of kids. The majority of kids fall in the middle of the distribution, and these are the kids between 90 and 110 in terms of their IQ ranges. Most school age pupils fall within this range. And if they don't have significant learning disabilities, they can reasonably learn grade level tasks presented by teachers. And they only stand out to teachers when they are in contexts in which the majority of the students have either significantly higher IQs or significantly lower IQs. And let me kind of explain what I mean by that. Let's say you have kids that are within this average range, but they just happen to be in a learning environment in which most of the kids around them have higher IQs. And this might be the case with certain private schools. Then you'll find that these students will come off to their teachers as being slower, and it'll be a little bit harder for them to keep up with the rest of their peers. Now, they are average, they have no problems in terms of their general mental ability, but they just happen to be in a context with peers that are higher than them, and as a result, they struggle a little bit. Or it could be the other way around. You could have average IQ kids that are in a classroom, but most of the other kids in the classroom have lower IQs than they do. And as a result, compared to those kids, they will appear bright to their teachers. So the main point here is that kids with average IQs will not stand out to teachers, that they will not be problems in terms of learning the material, but they will only stand out if they are in context in which the other kids are either significantly higher than they are or significantly lower than they are. Okay, going higher. How about kids between IQs of 115 to 130? Okay, these are kids that you'll tend to find they tend to enjoy school subjects for which they have a personal interest. They generally, unlike slow learners, they will generally enjoy reading, and they will be self-motivated to read books that interest them. So whenever a school has a book fair or whatever, these are the kids that love to go to book fairs. They love to buy books and get books that interest them. So they are good readers. In high school, these are the kids that take the advanced classes and the electives of physics, chemistry, trigonometry, or foreign languages. In high school, these are the kids that tend to be enrolled in advanced placement or AP classes. And generally, teachers find these kids to be the A and B students in the classroom. And then finally, what do you see with students who are at the extremely high end of the normal curve? And these are the students that have IQs above 130. These students are very rare in the general population, but you'll observe that from birth, they tend to reach developmental milestones faster than their average IQ peers. They will tend to roll over faster. They'll tend to walk faster. They'll tend to talk faster than average kids. You'll tend to see that even at young ages, they will use advanced vocabulary that is unusual for their age. They have a very, very high degree of curiosity about the world. They're always asking the adults why. So you think you give them an answer that satisfies them, but then they keep pressing. Well, why? Well, why? And you'll note that they just have this keen curiosity about the world. It's very easy for them to think in complex ways. They easily grasp concepts that are abstract. So these may be the kids that even if they're in 10th or 11th grade, they start to take calculus and they start to understand advanced subjects like calculus. These are the students that persevere on intellectual tasks for long periods of time that are age appropriate. They have a broad spectrum of intellectual interests. In other words, they're good at many subjects. They have very strong critical thinking skills. And you'll tend to find that when you compare their achievement to other peers, they tend to be at 1 to 2 grade levels above their same age peers. So many times these are the students that skip a grade somewhere in junior high or high school. These are the students that have they have IQs that are several standard deviations above the mean. Uh, some very, very bright students start attending graduate school in their preteens, and there's even reports of very high IQ students that will get their PhD degrees while they're still in their teens or early 20s. So I know I rushed through that, but I wanted to really get to that because I wanted you to know that when you give IQ tests in schools, you're giving them for a reason. You're giving them to gather information about general learning ability, and that has very, very real life applications to what teachers experience in schools. So I'll stop there and ask for any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Frisby. We have lots of questions coming in through the chat. One that came out pretty early on was, how do school psychs in California identify cognitive disabilities among Black students if they are not able to give IQ tests?
The reason why I'm laughing is that that's a very excellent question that has been basically a thorn in the side for a variety of school districts in California. When the judge made his ruling in 1979, and then the California Department of Education banned IQ tests in the early 80s, early to mid 80s. A big question that was faced by school districts is now what do we do? And so the California Department of Education promised school psychologists in the state that they would give them direction, but they really didn't give them direction. And so even to this day, and again, California school psychologists have been going through this for about 4 decades now. No one school district does the same thing. All they know is that we can't give IQ tests. So uh, there were efforts in California to try to put together alternative assessments, but they found out that if you can't give an IQ test, you basically have to cobble together all of these, some of them were achievement tests, some of them were rating scales, some of them were observations. You had to just give them a huge and time consuming array of different batteries to try to figure that out. And it was very, very time inefficient. So even to this day, uh, the California districts did not come to any consensus about what to do, because as soon as they thought that, well, we can give this test, someone would then say, no, that's an IQ test. Well, can we give this test? And then someone would say, no, you can't give that because that's an IQ test. So I can't answer that question with a set thing. This is something that was a thorn in the side to all the districts. And you could just audibly hear a sigh of relief when the California State Department of Education just recently relaxed those standards. So there's no answer. I mean, I have opinions about what they might be able to do, but I don't know if this is something that all school districts do. And my opinion is basically, if you can't give an IQ test, then you need to rely on achievement tests. And many of those achievement tests are group administered. You can do curriculum based assessments. And sometimes, if you're really faithful at doing curriculum based assessments, you'll see how a person who is very low in their IQ, they just don't keep up with the rest of the class in terms of the skills that they're learning. So their slopes will be very, very low compared to the slopes in curriculum-based assessment as to the other, what the other students are doing. So uh, observe the kids, give them achievement tests, do curriculum-based assessments, and that's probably the best that you'll be able to do.
Great, thank you so much. Another one that came in excited that conducting IQ tests for SLB with African American children as providing comprehensive evaluation with the strongest measures available has not been an option for too long. Is this change a mandate in all schools? Are all school districts making this change, or is this going to be another equity issue for African American students?
No, this particular issue that I'm talking about just occurred in California.
Thank you.
And if I do outline in my book that there were other states in which court cases, similar court class action lawsuits were brought against a school district or the state, but in many of those decisions, the judge uh, uh, argued in favor of IQ tests. In other words, the judge said that no, I don't find any evidence that there's bias in IQ tests. So when I talk about this problem, it only occurred in the state of California.
Mm-hmm.
And other states are fine. They're allowed to give IQ tests to all kids.
Great, thank you. Another question, it would be helpful to understand why students in certain groups are found to score lower than others. If it's not a bias or standardization problem, then what is causing the different groups to perform differently?
Yeah, this is a very, very common question that is brought after a presentation like this. And I've found that when I was, a faculty member, and I would basically have a unit on this, invariably I would get someone to say, well, why is there a difference? And that's where the political acrimony is, because basically the issue that I want to get across to practitioners is that the differences are real. In other words, human groups all throughout the globe have different distributions of scores on cognitive tests, and that's found in any continent on the globe, any region of the globe. You get these different distributions, but at the same time, there's overlap in the distributions. So whenever you try to say, well, is this saying that one group is intellectually inferior to another group? You can't say that because there's so much overlap. Every group has the full range of kids from one end being having mental retardation all the way up to individuals who are super gifted. Every group has that. The only difference there is in the means. So where you have the arguments among people is that you do have geneticists and other people who argue that the differences deal with kind of genetic issues, and of course that is offensive to many people, and so there's arguments against that. And again, my uh, uh, conclusion is that don't worry about that. Only worry about the question of, are tests biased? And if you find that tests are not biased, then you have confidence in using tests. And what you'll see is that you're going to run across kids in every group that have the full range of mental capabilities. So I guess, the answer in a nutshell, don't worry about that issue. Just worry about the issue is there anything wrong with the test? And the message from this webinar is that pretty much the tests that we use are good instruments.
Great. One attendee said that most of their professors in grad school believe that tests are biased. Most of what they learned about standardized testing in undergrad was influenced by the idea that the tests are biased. There's no empirical data to support the notion that these tests are biased. But then why is the predominant mindset of that in post-secondary education? And how do they combat that notion? What professional associations and organizations are doing something to counter that?
Very good question. Basically, this issue overlaps with politics and socio-political ideologies. And so, everyone knows that whenever you look at the real world and you look about and you look on such topics as gifted education in schools, college admissions, certification tests for different occupational groups, there's always acrimony and always tension and always conflicts related to the fact that groups don't give you the same proportional outcomes. So you'll tend to find that if you have any kind of a selection situation where you have to use a test and you say that anyone who takes the test has to achieve a score above X, whatever that score is, you'll find that there are different proportions of groups that basically are eligible if you have that cutoff score. And as soon as you have that, you instantly hear accusations that tests are biased and people want to get rid of tests. And this is a serious problem all throughout society. There are many people who were successful in convincing colleges and universities to not require SAT tests or ACT tests because they said that the outcomes from those scores show bias. And so you had many colleges and universities that basically uh, abandoned giving any kind of an entrance test. And you had that issue in many other situations. But as soon as you do that, there are associated problems that come with that. And of course, most of you know that there was a Supreme Court case that was recently decided that basically said that colleges cannot use affirmative action standards to admit students. And that decision came directly out of situations where colleges would not even use scores and would just make decisions based upon whatever group you belong to. So it's a very acrimonious issue, and it's no surprise that you ran across many professors that are telling you that tests are biased. It's no surprise there, and that's one of the points in this webinar is that they're wrong. They're wrong. They're telling you something that is untrue. And so in order for you to be confident in what you're doing, you need to know what are the arguments, what does the data say? And if you look at the data, we've seen across many decades that psychometric empirical data shows consistently that well-developed tests are evaluated for bias long before they're published. And by the time they're published, they show no bias. Now, that's not to say now that you could run across special populations somewhere in the United States that are so isolated or so culturally different that the tests wouldn't be good to administer to them simply because they're so unusual. And so there have been studies, for example, where you've looked at some isolated Native American groups that are so isolated from the mainstream that many of the traditional tests that we would give, the vocabulary subtests and defining words and all that, they wouldn't do well because they're so isolated from the mainstream. But these tend to be very, very unusual and rare groups. But nevertheless, you should do bias studies with those groups because you may find that the regular tests that we give are not appropriate with those groups, and you need to give something else. But by and large, if you're English speaking and you're American born, regardless of your race or ethnicity, the tests show no evidence of bias. And the minute you say that, you're going to get opposition.
Great. Couple of questions have come in about classes or socioeconomic status. How does that impact outcomes on cognitive assessments?
Again, that's another complex question. Let me try to answer it concisely. Generally, the idea is that there's a threshold below which you can expect to 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 see a person's environment negatively affect test scores, but that threshold has to be very low. In other words, you in order for kids to truly be negatively impacted, we're talking about kids that grow up in the woods, away from civilization. They may be in institutions locked away. They may be chained up in a closet somewhere where you don't feed them or they don't get sleep or what have you. The conditions have to be very impoverished. And usually, whenever you find those situations, once you rescue kids from those situations and you give them the adequate nourishment and the adequate shelter and so forth, you'll see their IQ scores shoot up because biologically they are being fed and they are being cared for. But generally, with most people living in, particularly in Western countries, socioeconomic status is a result of IQ. It doesn't influence IQ. In other words, one of the things that we all have to recognize is that in life, when you were in school, there were kids that did well in school, kids that didn't do well in school. And as you rose up through the grades, you're in junior high now. Some kids gravitated towards the intellectual courses, other kids gravitated towards the non-intellectual courses. Then as you got to high school, there were some kids that they knew they were going to college. They had the grades to go to college, but there were other kids that were just not interested in going to college. It had no motivation for them. So as you begin to be in high school and leave high school, people begin to distribute themselves across different kinds of professions. You have those students that go on to get advanced degrees. They become doctors, they become lawyers, they become engineers, they become scientists. And, those are the people that had to spend, years in graduate school, interacting with very complex, intellectual tasks. So by the time they graduated, obviously, those are the people that are going to get jobs that are high paying in the six figures or so. And once you have that, then these are people that tend to marry other people that are like them. They tend to buy houses in good neighborhoods. They tend to send their kids to good schools and what have you. So, what we're saying basically is that if you have a high IQ and you go through life, you're going to tend to make more money and you're going to tend to create around you an environment that has a lot of advantages to it. On the other side, if you're someone that didn't do well in school, you didn't have an interest in school, intellectual things are not particularly motivating to you, you rather work in other areas, you might be a person that throughout your adult life, you only work in unskilled jobs. And then you tend to earn a salary that's lower. And if you earn a salary that's lower, you're going to live in neighborhoods that are not as good. So the point of all this is that, we tend to think that SES influences IQ, but a lot of this is the other way around. It's whatever your IQ is that tends to influence SES. And most of the high IQ people, like the geniuses, the Albert Einsteins, people who are just prolific in terms of their accomplishments, most of these individuals grew up in lower SES environments. So the environment never dampened their achievements, but they were just kids that happened to be born in poor environments, but they had a high IQ. And as a result, their high IQ led them to achievement and accomplishment. And now their SES tends to be high, not because of how they grew up, but because they just tended to be bright. So we have to be careful in in uh, in accepting this idea that your SES influences your IQ. Many times it's the other way around, and we give IQ tests because we want to identify kids who are super bright, but who are growing up in environments in which they're not easy to identify, and that's the value of giving good IQ tests is to identify those bright kids that would be overlooked if you just looked at their living situations. I don't know.
Great.
Does that answer the question or?
Yeah, I think so for sure. That's very helpful. I'd say the number one question we're getting today is what intellectual IQ or cognitive ability assessments do you recommend that have uh, that you've had a good experience with, that you feel like don't have a lot of bias or that are good when using with diverse populations?
Okay, well, I'm just going to say as a general response to that, most, nearly all IQ tests that are developed by large scale companies are good. So, it's just that, some IQ tests have higher name recognition compared to other tests. And so, you'll tend to find that the Wechsler tests tend to be the more popular because people are just used to the Wechsler instruments. But I'd say almost every test is a good test. The Wechsler tests are good. Stanford Binet, they're going to come out with an update pretty soon. Stanford Binet tests are good. The Woodcock tests are good. The Reynolds intellectual assessment scales are good. The Naglieri scales are good. I'd say that when deciding which tests to use, there are other considerations that you might want to adhere to that might lead you to feel that one test is better than the other. So, to give it an example, when I was a school psychologist back in the 80s or 90s or what have you, many people liked the Woodcock simply because it was easier to administer. All you have is basically an easel, and all you needed to do was just flip pages. And many people liked that because they just didn't prefer having all of these materials to manipulate. So they preferred the Woodcock. Not because it's necessarily developed better than any other test, but just simply because of that feature. I also remember when I was working as a school psychologist that many other psychologists tended to prefer the Stanford Binet whenever they were testing gifted kids because they felt that the Stanford Binet test had a higher ceiling of items that allowed them to distinguish between kids of very high IQs. So that's one of the reasons why they tend to prefer that. Um, if you're doing a research study or if you're doing an assessment in schools in which you only had a few minutes, then you might want to choose one of the tests that only took 15, 20 minutes to give. So I know the the RIAS test, the Reynolds Intellectual Assessment Scales, it has a short version test that you can give in only 15 minutes. And so that might be more advantageous for you if you really had to test using efficient time schedules. I know when I was a school psychologist, many times there was a backlog of gifted evaluations. So they would pay a lot of the school psychologists for over the summer to just test all these kids who were referred for gifted. And whenever we did that, we didn't give the whole test. We would just give tests that tended to be briefer. So you might pick a scale that it's shorter to give because that means you could test a lot more kids within a particular time frame. So I guess my answer to all of this is basically all tests pretty much good, but you may pick or choose a test because of other reasons that make that test to be more attractive than any other test. But all tests are pretty much developed with good psychometric development before they are ever published.
Great, thank you. A couple of questions about administering with an interpreter or those that have limited English speaking skills or even nonverbal students.
Yes, and I had a whole section in which I talked about that, but I ran out of time. And so the basic, and let me see if I can just order the basic idea there is that um, you have different situations that call for different kinds of assessment. So, what do I mean by that? If you're dealing with any child that speaks another language other than English, and you're not sure which language is dominant, across the board, you should always give that child some kind of a language proficiency assessment. And that is just some kind of a rating scale in which, it gives you information as to which language tends to be dominant. So that is, across the board, whoever you're dealing with. If you're dealing with, let's say, a Spanish speaking student who grew up in one of the regions of America, maybe in the Southwest, New Mexico, Arizona, what have you, there are very good tests that have been standardized and normed on that population. And I think one of them are the Woodcock tests. The Woodcock company has tests that were standardized on Spanish speaking students living in various areas of the United States. So, that's always the the top choice is to give that kind of a student a test in their primary language. In this case, it would be Spanish, and you have norms that you can compare to other Spanish speaking kids. Now, sometimes you don't have that. Sometimes you may have a kid that comes from France or comes from some other country in which we don't have tests that are normed on that language. So the issue is, what do you do? And so in those kind of situations, many times you have to give a nonverbal test to that particular child. And by nonverbal, I mean any test in which the test items don't include, asking kids to define words or interact with sentences or understand verbal concepts, but they just basically interact with puzzle type tasks. And these are tasks that can be given that will give you a very reliable IQ score for a person that speaks language other than English. The disadvantage of that, however, is that you're not getting any assessment of their verbal skills. And so that's the trade-off. You are getting an assessment of their nonverbal intelligence, but not very much on their verbal skills. And so that would be my advice there. If a kid speaks a language in which there's no test that has been standardized on that language, you give a test like the Universal Nonverbal Intelligence Scale, or one of the I think Naglieri has a few scales, nonverbal assessment scales. Give those kinds of tests. Finally, you just have to be aware of the issue of using translators. And you may have a situation in which, a child speaks a certain language. Let's say you have a psychologist that speaks that language and also speaks English. And you say, well, I'm going to sit down and give them an English test, like, the WIS 5 or some other test that is totally in English, but I'll have that translator translate the items to the child's language. So in essence, there will be three people in the testing situation: the child, the interpreter, and then maybe somebody else might be there just to oversee things. That may be something that school districts do, but you have to recognize that there's a trade-off there. And if you do it that way, many times the individual items of the scale have different properties because they haven't been studied by a test company. So if you just take an item in English and then you try to translate it on the fly to another language and then give it to the child, you don't have any data that will tell you what the difficulty level of that item is, because it could be that when you translated it that way, it made the item more easy or more difficult for the child. So while that's something that you can do if you don't have any other options, there's some danger there because you really don't know the psychometric features of the actual test that you gave in that other language. So there are trade-offs, and so that's those are some ideas that I would have about issues where you have a person of another language. Either get a test that's been standardized on that language. If you can't do that, give them a nonverbal test. If you can't do that, use an interpreter. And each one of those has pros and cons to it.
Great, thank you. A couple of questions have come in about how to use intelligence tests and what recommendations you have for geriatric populations and for forensic evaluations.
I would need a little bit more information on that question, so I can just maybe respond by just a little bit of what I know. I mean, basically, when you're dealing with geriatric folks, you always want to compare their scores to a reference group of the same age. And usually what we find is that the older people get, the more their skills slip and the more they're not as sharp, particularly in fluid G type tasks. So I would say, just give a regular test as long as they speak English and you speak English, give them the test, but compare their scores against people of the same age. And that way you can get an accurate assessment. Obviously, if you try to compare scores taken from a 95-year-old person to scores of people in their 20s, the 95-year-old is always going to do worse, and you're going to get an inaccurate score because you're not comparing them to the right reference group. So that's is what I would say. In terms of forensics, I don't necessarily know why a forensic evaluation may be different from a regular evaluation. So I'm not sure as to maybe how to answer that question. Is there anything about forensic populations that are different from non-forensic populations?
I think it was just a general question to compare it to, some of this that is more focused on using it with students in schools.
Yeah, I mean, IQ tests are pretty good. I mean, they can be used with students in schools, students in hospitals, forensic, whatever. So I don't think that there's anything about a forensic population that would make them different that may require a different type of test.
Any advice for those evaluating students that are profoundly disabled?
Yeah, I mean, if you're a clinician that doesn't have a lot of experience with that group, then if I were in your shoes, I would recommend always try to seek out someone with better experience with that group, because there are many issues in the testing, particularly those issues related to kind of motor manipulation of uh, of blocks and cards and those kind of things that may be an issue. And then there might be some verbal issues if the person who is profoundly disabled can't get out what they're trying to say in a clear way. That could undermine testing. So I would try to seek out someone who has more experience in that and see if I'm really not secure about my abilities there, to try to invite someone to sit in with you on the assessment so that they can help you with that. Other
You're on
questions?
mute, Aaron.
Sorry about that. Can you talk about some of the differences between IQ and executive function as it relates to assessment?
I mean, you're saying differences. I mean, I know that executive functioning is a popular issue these days. And as my understanding of that is, all that means is that if you're presented with any kind of a task, how do you begin to organize your task to give yourself procedures and directions for laying out the task and answering the task? And even though people call that executive functioning, that's all part of general mental functioning. So that's all part of G. I wouldn't say that executive mental functioning is a construct that is different or separate from general mental ability. I would say that though any person who is high in G, general mental ability, would have good executive functioning. And there are just certain kinds of tests that tend to emphasize that more. And from my limited understanding, I think that the Naglieri test, the cognitive assessment system, is a test that has been specifically designed to try to get at those kinds of functioning better than maybe some other tests. So I would tend to say if that's something that you would really want to assess, I would point you to the CAS, cognitive assessment system, and I think that has a lot to say about executive functioning.
Great. I think we're almost out of time here, but wanted to thank you so much, Dr. Frisby, for sharing this information on us and sharing your research with our customers. I think we continue to see a lot of questions, so we'll make sure to get you a copy of those questions and give you a chance to respond to that and share that input out with people that attended. So thank you very much, Dr. Frisby, and thank you to all of our attendees that joined us for this webinar today. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.
And
Thank you.
I just want to say something finally before you leave. I really encourage folks, if there's something that you wanted to say that you didn't feel comfortable saying in this environment, I really want you to email me. My email is frisbycl, capital F, lowercase r, I, S, B, Y, CL at missouri.edu. And whatever questions you have, I'd be more than happy to answer them personally by email.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes. Thanks everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.